The decision. Roberto Morales sat quietly in his small bedroom in the heart of Austin, Texas. He gazed out of the window, watching the world rush by. The city was alive, a vibrant mix of cars, people, and buildings that seemed to pulse with energy. But inside his tiny room, time seemed to move slowly, almost too slowly. He could feel the weight of the years pressing on his chest, as though the walls were closing in on him. At 72, he was no longer the man who had once been the center of his family's world. No longer the man who could lift heavy boxes, fix broken appliances, or walk briskly down the street with his head held high. Those days felt like distant memories now. Roberto's health had begun to decline after his wife, Carmen, passed away 5 years ago. He had taken it hard. They had been married for over 4 decades, and Carmen was the love of his life. Their home had once been filled with laughter, with Carmen's cooking filling the house with the scent of her famous chili and warm tortillas. But now it was just silence, punctuated by the sound of Roberto's slow, labored breathing. His son Alejandro, a man in his 40s with a steady job as a marketing executive, had insisted that Roberto move in with him and his wife, Mariana. At first, Roberto had resisted. He didn't want to be a burden, didn't want to feel like an inconvenience to his son, who had his own family to take care of. But Alejandro had been persistent, and after some time, Roberto reluctantly agreed. The first few months had been tolerable. Alejandro and Mariana were kind, patient, and attentive. But as time went on, Roberto began to feel more like a guest than a part of the family. The small room he occupied had once been his grandson's, a boy named Mateo, but the room felt too quiet for a child's space. Roberto never dared ask for more. His pride was still very much intact, even though his body no longer supported it. He didn't want to be the old man who was constantly in the way. The family's routines had begun to settle into a predictable rhythm. Alejandro would go to work early in the morning, Mariana would go to her job as a nurse, and Roberto would spend his days in the small room or in the living room, flipping through old photo albums or staring at the TV. Sometimes he would try to walk down the block to the park, but his knees ached too much to go far. But it wasn't just his body that was failing him. It was his mind. Roberto's memory had started to slip, something he noticed every time he couldn't remember where he left his glasses or when he found himself asking the same questions over and over. He could no longer keep track of the days of the week, and sometimes the simple act of getting dressed in the morning felt like a challenge. It was a slow, insidious decline, but it was there, and with each passing day, the guilt gnawed at him. He could feel it in his bones, the sense that he was becoming a burden, that his son and daughter-in-law were caring for him out of obligation rather than love. It was a painful thought, one he tried to push away, but it crept back every time he saw Alejandro's weary face when he came home from work. Roberto knew that something had to change. He had made a decision. The guilt was too much, and he could no longer bear the thought of being a burden. He didn't want to end up as one of those elderly people who were forgotten, shuffled off to a nursing home when their families could no longer handle them. He would rather go somewhere else, somewhere he could be at peace with himself. Late one night, while Alejandro and Mariana were out, Roberto sat at the kitchen table with a pen in hand. He wrote a letter to his son. The letter was short and simple. Alejandro, I love you and I love your family, but I cannot live with the feeling that I am a burden. I've made arrangements to go to a nursing home. I hope you understand. I'll always be here for you, but it's time for me to go. He left the letter on the kitchen counter, where he knew Alejandro would find it in the morning. Roberto didn't want a big scene, didn't want to have to explain himself over and over. He simply wanted to go in peace. The next morning, Alejandro found the letter, and his heart sank. He didn't understand. Roberto had been so resistant to the idea of a nursing home before, always saying he would rather live out his final years in his own home, surrounded by family. But now he was saying the opposite. Alejandro couldn't imagine life without his father under the same roof. He needed to talk to him, to convince him that he wasn't a burden. But when he tried to call Roberto, his father didn't answer. There was only silence. Alejandro's worry grew as the day wore on. He couldn't help but feel that something was wrong, that his father wasn't just tired or confused. There was a finality to the letter, a quiet resolution that made Alejandro uneasy. He called his wife, Mariana, and together they made the decision. They would take Roberto out of the house for a day, to get him out of the routine, to talk to him. Perhaps if they gave him some space, he would reconsider. Alejandro's heart was heavy as he drove to Roberto's room, but what happened next was something he could never have expected. As Roberto sat in the car, he gazed out the window, feeling the familiar pang of guilt twist inside him. It was almost as if he could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. He was leaving his family, leaving his home. His thoughts were a whirlwind, but beneath it all, a small part of him felt a sense of relief. He had made the choice, and now there was no turning back. When they arrived at their destination, Roberto's stomach churned. He had spent the last several days picturing this moment in his mind. His son dropping him off at the nursing home, saying his goodbyes. But as the car came to a halt and Roberto stepped out of the vehicle, he froze. The scene before him was nothing like what he had imagined. The unexpected turn. Roberto Morales stood still, his heart pounding in his chest. The car door had barely swung open when he stepped out onto the cracked pavement, his shoes making a soft thud as he shifted his weight. His legs felt weaker than ever, and a wave of dizziness threatened to overtake him. But it wasn't the weakness in his body that caused the chill to run down his spine. It was the sight that greeted him. In front of him stood a large two-story building. But this wasn't the sterile, institutional-looking nursing home he had imagined. No, this place looked different, welcoming, even. The brick facade was warm, not cold. Vines climbed up the walls, and in the front yard, colorful flowers bloomed in neat rows. It looked like a home. A beautiful home, not the final stop on a lonely journey. Roberto's breath caught in his throat as he turned to Alejandro, who was just a few steps behind him. His son was already out of the car, eyes fixed firmly on the ground, his hands nervously tugging at the sleeves of his jacket. "Alejandro, what is this?" Roberto's voice was hoarse, cracked with confusion. His son paused, glancing up but avoiding his father's gaze. Roberto could see the hesitation in his eyes, the unreadable emotions swirling in them. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them, an unbearable silence that stretched across the distance like a chasm neither of them could cross. Alejandro started, but he faltered, taking a deep breath before trying again. "I wanted to show you something, Dad. I wanted you to see that you don't have to. You don't have to be alone." "Not like that." His voice cracked, and Roberto noticed his son's eyes glistening with unshed tears. Roberto blinked, his mind racing to catch up with the words. "Alejandro, what do you mean?" "I thought we were here. For the nursing home." He felt a flicker of panic in his chest as his thoughts tangled with the reality before him. What was going on? Was he being tricked? Had his son somehow found a way to convince him to stay here, to live out his final days away from his family? Before Alejandro could respond, the door of the building opened. A woman stepped out, dressed in a casual, yet professional manner. She had a warm smile on her face, a genuine kindness in her eyes that immediately put Roberto on edge. She was older than him, maybe in her 60s, but her energy seemed youthful and vibrant. "Ah, Roberto. Welcome, welcome," the woman greeted, her voice carrying a calm assurance. She extended her hand, and Roberto hesitated before shaking it. Her grip was firm, but not overpowering. Who are you?" Roberto asked, still bewildered by the entire situation. His heart thudded in his chest, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a pang of fear. "My name is Linda," the woman said, her smile never fading. "I'm the director here at the Maplewood House. I understand Alejandro has already told you a little about us. She looked over at his son, who nodded, though his face was still strained. The Maplewood house. Roberto muttered, confused. This isn't a nursing home. No, no, Linda said, shaking her head. This is a special kind of place. Not a nursing home, not an assisted living facility. We're more like a community, a family. We offer a home for people like you, Roberto, who need a little extra care but don't want to lose their independence. We offer a place where you can thrive, not just survive. Roberto's heart skipped a beat. Thrive? I'm not sure I understand. Linda gave a knowing smile, as though she'd heard that question 1,000 times before. Let me show you around, and I think you'll understand. She turned, leading the way toward the entrance. Alejandro walked quietly behind them, his footsteps hesitant but steady. Roberto followed slowly, still trying to process the unexpected turn his day had taken. As he walked, his eyes lingered on the garden in front of him. The flowers, bright marigolds, lavender, and sunflowers, created an inviting oasis. The air smelled fresh, like rain had recently fallen. The whole place was like something out of a dream. It wasn't the cold, imposing building he'd feared. It felt warm and alive, almost as though it had been designed specifically to put people at ease. When they entered the building, Roberto was hit by the cozy, welcoming atmosphere. There were soft chairs arranged around a fireplace in the lobby, and the walls were adorned with art, colorful paintings, family portraits, and scenic photographs that created an intimate, lived-in feel. A few residents sat in the lounge area, chatting softly among themselves, sipping coffee or reading books. It looked more like a gathering place than a place of care. Linda led Roberto through a few hallways, each one more inviting than the last. She pointed out the different amenities: activity rooms where people could paint, craft, or practice yoga, a library filled with old and new books, a dining area where residents gathered for home-cooked meals every day. It was nothing like the sterile environment Roberto had imagined. There were no long hallways lined with rows of rooms, no constant beeping of machines, or the smell of antiseptic in the air. Finally, Linda stopped in front of a door, smiling as she opened it. "This could be your room," she said gently. Roberto stepped inside, his eyes scanning the space. The room was small but charming. There was a large window that overlooked the garden, a comfy armchair in the corner, and a bed with soft, plush bedding. On the desk by the window, a vase of fresh flowers sat, their colors vibrant against the light from outside. It was a room that seemed to invite peace, a space where one could rest and find comfort. This is beautiful," Roberto whispered, his voice tinged with awe. He turned to Linda. "But why? Why are you showing me this? I thought I was just here to leave, to go to a nursing home." Linda smiled warmly, her eyes twinkling with understanding. "You're not just here to leave, Roberto. You're here to start something new. You're here to be a part of a community, to rediscover your independence, and to make new memories. You can stay as long as you want. There's no pressure, no time limit. And most importantly, you can do it on your own terms." Roberto felt his chest tighten. Was this what he had been missing? A place where he could truly live again, not just wait for the end. He looked at Alejandro, who had stepped back, standing by the door, his face flushed with emotion. "Alejandro, did you know about this?" Roberto asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Alejandro nodded, his eyes soft with sincerity. "I knew, Dad. I just wanted you to see it for yourself. I wanted you to know you don't have to go somewhere you're uncomfortable. I want you to be happy, and I know you still have so much to offer. This place, it's not just for people who are at the end of their road. It's for people who still want to live fully." Roberto stood still, his mind whirling. It felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, though the uncertainty still lingered in his chest. Could he really do this? Could he embrace this new chapter of his life, even when it felt so unfamiliar? For the first time in years, Roberto felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps there was still time for him to be more than just a burden, more than just a shadow in his family's life. Maybe, just maybe, this unexpected turn was the beginning of something beautiful, a chance to reclaim his dignity and joy. He took a deep breath, looked at Alejandro, and then back at Linda. I think I need some time to think, he said, his voice thick with emotion. But this place, it feels like home. And for the first time in a long time, Roberto felt a spark of possibility. The struggle within. The next few days were a whirlwind of emotions for Roberto Morales. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the same faces, the kind, patient staff of Maplewood House, the colorful garden, the warm, welcoming rooms. But no matter how many times he looked at the pictures, the brochures, or even his son's pleading eyes, one thought kept circling in his mind like an insistent clock. Is this where I'm meant to be? At first, Roberto had been hopeful, even excited. This place felt nothing like the grim institutional facilities he had imagined in his head. But now that the initial shock had worn off, the reality of the decision weighed heavily on his heart. He had spent the better part of his life as an independent man, a proud man, a man who, even in his old age, never wanted to depend on anyone. But here, in this bright, inviting space, it was as if everything he had known was being stripped away. The room he had been assigned at Maplewood House was, as Linda had shown him, charming and peaceful. It was filled with soft lighting, fresh flowers, and a view of the garden that Roberto had come to love. But each night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, and the quiet of the building settled in, a heavy emptiness filled his chest. He had spent his life caring for others. His wife, Carmen, his son, Alejandro, even his elderly parents when they had grown frail. He had always been the provider, the protector. But now, sitting in this room that wasn't truly his, surrounded by people who were strangers to him, Roberto couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something. Something that he could never get back. And yet there was something else in his heart, a tiny ember of hope. Could this place really be a new beginning for him? Could it really be the community Alejandro had promised? There was only one way to find out, and that was to take that first difficult step. The following morning, after another restless night, Roberto decided he would leave his room. He had been staying mostly to himself, wandering the halls in a daze when he wasn't eating or sleeping. There were a few residents who had introduced themselves to him, all friendly and eager to chat, but Roberto had never been one for small talk. He had always preferred the quiet, the solitude. But today, something felt different. He pulled on his shoes, and with a deep breath, he opened the door to his room. As he stepped into the hallway, the hum of activity filled the air. It was a slow, comforting hum, voices low in conversation, the clinking of plates in the dining area, the distant sound of a piano being played softly. He followed the sound of the piano, and soon he found himself in a cozy common room where a woman was sitting at an upright piano. Her long, silver hair cascaded down her back, and she played with a sense of quiet confidence, her fingers dancing over the keys as if they had known this melody for years. Roberto stood there for a moment, just listening. The music was beautiful, almost haunting, and it reached deep into him. There was something about the way she played, something tender and familiar, that stirred a memory he hadn't thought about in years. He could almost hear Carmen's voice singing along to the same tune, the two of them sitting on the porch during their younger years, enjoying the simple moments. The woman at the piano finished the piece, and Roberto found himself clapping, surprising himself with the warmth in his chest. She looked up, and her eyes twinkled when she saw him. "Good morning," she said, her voice warm. "I didn't see you before. I'm Beatrice. Welcome to Maplewood House." Roberto smiled, although it was a little unsure. "Thank you. That was beautiful. It reminded me of something, of a time I've almost forgotten." Beatrice smiled back, the lines around her eyes crinkling. Music has a way of doing that. It brings back memories, doesn't it? It's like a bridge between the past and present. The way she spoke made Roberto feel lighter, as though he was connecting to something important. He realized that he hadn't truly connected with anyone since Carmen passed. He'd been alone in his grief, alone in his home. Perhaps this place, this strange new chapter of his life, could offer him something he had longed for without realizing it. "Do you play often?" Roberto asked, finding his voice again. "Oh yes," Beatrice said with a laugh. "I've been playing the piano for more than 50 years. It's a big part of who I am. In fact, I run a small music group here at Maplewood. We get together every Wednesday to play and sing. Maybe you'd like to join us. We'd love to have you." Roberto hesitated. He had never been a musician, but there was something about the invitation that felt genuine, unforced. Perhaps, he thought, it was a way to connect with others, a way to stop feeling so isolated in this new place. "I don't know. I'm not much of a singer," Roberto said, chuckling softly. "No problem at all," Beatrice said, her smile never wavering. "We're not here to perform for anyone, just for the joy of it. You can come and listen if you prefer. The important thing is being together, enjoying the music." For the first time since he'd arrived, Roberto felt a little tug of curiosity. Maybe it was time to let go of the bitterness, the loneliness. Maybe it was time to give this place a chance. That afternoon, after lunch, Roberto made his way to the small activity room, where Beatrice had told him the music group would meet. When he arrived, a handful of residents were already there, seated in chairs with instruments, guitars, violins, a few tambourines, and one other piano. They all greeted Roberto with friendly smiles, not the awkward politeness he had expected, but a warmth that felt like an embrace. As he took a seat in the back of the room, Beatrice began to play a soft melody, and the others joined in. Slowly, the room filled with music, a beautiful, collaborative sound that was more like a conversation than a performance. Roberto watched as people hummed along, tapped their feet, and played with a joy that was contagious. Something shifted inside him. The weight in his chest lightened, and for the first time in days, Roberto felt as if he were part of something bigger than himself. This wasn't just a nursing home. This wasn't just a place where people went to fade away. No, this was a community, a real community where people came together, shared stories, and lived, truly lived. He stayed for the entire session, listening, humming along softly under his breath, and even tapping his fingers to the beat. When the music ended, Roberto felt more alive than he had in years. He realized that this was just one of many opportunities in this new place. He had a long way to go before he could call it home, but he had made a start. Later that evening, as he sat in the quiet of his room, Roberto couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. He thought of his old home, the place where he had lived with Carmen for decades. He missed it. The creaking floors, the familiar smells, the warmth of the kitchen where Carmen used to cook. But now, as he looked out the window at the soft glow of the streetlights outside, he realized that this place, Maplewood House, might not be so bad after all. It wasn't a replacement for his old life, but maybe it was the next chapter. For the first time in a long while, Roberto felt a flicker of excitement about the future. Perhaps he had been wrong to resist this change. Maybe this place, full of new faces and possibilities, was where he could finally start again, breaking through the walls. It had been a week since Roberto Morales first stepped into Maplewood House, and while he hadn't quite found the peace he had been searching for, there was a subtle shift taking place inside him. Every day felt like a step into unfamiliar territory, a journey toward something that, until recently, had seemed impossible: connection. In the mornings, after a quiet breakfast with the other residents, Roberto had started to venture out of his room more often. He'd joined the small book club that met on Thursdays, even though he hadn't read a book in years. He found himself listening intently as others shared their thoughts, realizing that he had more to contribute than he thought. A few of the residents would gather to play cards in the lounge, and Roberto found himself joining in. It was a simple game of bridge, a game he hadn't played in decades, but it felt strangely comforting, like slipping into an old coat he had long since forgotten. But even with these small breakthroughs, Roberto's heart was still heavy. He had yet to fully accept the idea that this place could become home. There were nights when he still lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the ache of loneliness creep back into his bones. He missed Carmen more than ever. The absence of her was like a cold shadow that loomed over everything he did. No matter how warm the community at Maplewood House seemed, no matter how inviting the rooms or the garden, the hole left by her death was impossible to fill. One morning, after a restless night, Roberto woke to the sound of soft rain tapping against the window. He hadn't planned on getting out of bed so early, but the steady rhythm of the raindrops seemed to pull him awake, urging him to rise. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, feeling the coolness of the wooden floor beneath his feet. For a moment, he simply stood there, looking out at the garden below, which was now damp and lush with rain. He had always loved rainy mornings. Carmen used to say that they were perfect for thinking about the past, the future, and everything in between. Roberto didn't know what had come over him, but today he felt compelled to go outside. The air was fresh, thick with the earthy smell of wet soil and leaves. The residents of Maplewood House often gathered in the common areas or attended the various scheduled activities, but few ventured outside when it rained. He wasn't sure why, but Roberto wanted the solitude, the quiet of nature, the simplicity of walking alone. Pulling on his jacket, he made his way to the back door, stepping outside into the rain. The drops hit his skin like little pinpricks, but he didn't mind. The rain had always been a reminder that there was life, even in the darkest moments. It washed everything clean, gave the earth new life. He could feel the rhythm of it as he walked slowly through the garden, letting the cool rain trickle down his face. As he walked, his mind began to clear. He thought about his life, about Carmen, about the years they had spent together in their old house. He remembered the sound of her laughter, the way her hands moved when she cooked, the way she would hold his hand before they went to sleep at night. But now, that part of his life was gone. There was no going back. And yet, as he walked through the garden, surrounded by the freshness of the rain-soaked plants, Roberto began to wonder if he could move forward. Could he? Could he let go of the past, even if it meant learning to live in a new way? The garden at Maplewood House was a small oasis, a peaceful sanctuary in the middle of a busy world. The rain had brought everything to life, and Roberto could see the leaves of the trees shimmering in the soft light, the flowers drooping under the weight of the rain, and the soft, plush grass that seemed to beckon him to sit. He found an empty bench beneath a large oak tree, its branches spread wide like protective arms. He sat down slowly, letting the rain fall around him, letting the stillness of the moment take over. It was here, in the rain-drenched garden, that something finally clicked inside Roberto. For the first time since he had arrived, he realized that he didn't have to forget his past. He didn't have to erase the love he had shared with Carmen or the life they had built together. He could carry it with him, in his heart, wherever he went, and it was that love that had shaped him into the man he was. But now, it was time to let that love fuel a new journey. This place, Maplewood House, was not a place of endings. It was a place of new beginnings. He could embrace this chapter, just as he had embraced the ones before. His heart could still expand, could still grow, even in his later years. The pain of his loss would never go away, but it didn't have to define his existence. Later that day, as the rain began to let up, Roberto returned to his room to change into dry clothes. He felt different, lighter somehow. He had let go of some of the weight he had been carrying for so long. The ache in his heart was still there, but it didn't feel so suffocating anymore. He was ready to engage with the world again, to take on the challenge of this new chapter in his life. Just as he finished changing, a soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," Roberto called, his voice steady but warm. The door creaked open, and Alejandro stepped inside. His face lit up when he saw his father, and Roberto noticed the relief that passed across his son's features. "Dad, you're up early today," Alejandro said, walking over to him. "How are you feeling?" Roberto gave a small smile. "Better. I took a walk in the garden. It's raining, but it feels good. I've been thinking." Alejandro nodded, his eyes searching Roberto's face as if looking for any signs of doubt or hesitation. "I'm glad to hear that, Dad. I know this place isn't home the way you knew it, but I'm happy you're giving it a chance." Roberto met his son's gaze, his eyes steady and clear. "Alejandro, I'm not going to lie. This isn't easy for me. But I realized something this morning, something important." "What's that?" Alejandro asked, his voice soft, almost as if he were afraid of the answer. "I realize that my life isn't over," Roberto said, his voice firm. "Just because I'm older doesn't mean I can't still grow. I may have lost a lot. Carmen, the house, the old life I knew. But that doesn't mean I can't find a new way to live. I can't erase the past, but I can embrace what's in front of me. I'm ready to start again, Alejandro." Alejandro's eyes filled with emotion as he stepped forward, placing his hand on Roberto's shoulder. "Dad, I don't think you'll ever really start over. What you had with Mom will always be part of you. But I'm glad you're opening yourself up to this new chapter. I just want you to be happy. That's all I want." Roberto looked at his son, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I think I am. Son, I think I am." That evening, as Roberto sat in the dining room at Maplewood House, surrounded by people who had slowly begun to feel like friends, he couldn't help but smile. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. The journey wasn't over yet. There was still much to be done, much to be discovered, but he had taken the first step. And that was enough for now. Embracing the unexpected. A full month had passed since Roberto Morales had first set foot in Maplewood House. While the transition had been challenging, there was no denying that something deep within him had shifted. He had moved past the initial shock of his new surroundings, past the sorrow of leaving his old home, and into a place where, for the first time in a long while, he was beginning to embrace life again. It wasn't perfect. He still missed Carmen every day, still felt the weight of the loss pressing down on his chest when he was alone in the quiet of his room. But Roberto had stopped seeing his grief as an enemy. Instead, he began to accept it as part of his journey, something he could carry with him, not as a burden, but as a testament to a life well lived. Maplewood House, with its vibrant garden, communal activities, and kind-hearted residents, was no longer just a place he had been placed in. It was becoming his home. Each day, he found new pieces of himself that had been buried beneath years of pride, stubbornness, and grief. Slowly but surely, Roberto was rediscovering what it meant to live, not just survive. It was a bright Tuesday morning when the next big step arrived. Roberto was sitting on the porch of Maplewood House, sipping a hot cup of coffee as he watched the world come to life outside. The sun was just starting to climb in the sky, casting a soft golden glow over the garden. The air was crisp, a welcome contrast to the sweltering Texas heat that had begun to ease. Alejandro had called the night before, asking if he could come by to visit. Roberto hadn't seen much of him lately. His son, ever the busy professional, had been caught up in work and had only managed to visit once or twice a week. Roberto understood. His own presence at this home, was still an adjustment. He wasn't sure how much he could ask of his son. But today, Alejandro promised he would make time. As Roberto sat, savoring the warmth of the coffee and the quiet, he found his thoughts wandering again, like they always did in the early mornings. He thought about how far he'd come. The thought of joining the group for breakfast didn't feel so daunting anymore. A month ago, he had hesitated, unsure whether he wanted to interact with anyone. Now, it felt more natural to sit at the large communal table with the other residents. He wasn't just eating breakfast. He was sharing his life with others. For the first time in years, Roberto realized that he could belong again. He wasn't just a passive participant in his own existence. he was living. When Alejandro arrived later that morning, Roberto was sitting in one of the wicker chairs by the window, lost in thought. His son, walking briskly, came into the room with a big smile, but Roberto could see the exhaustion in his eyes. The man who had once seemed so strong, so determined, now looked worn, his face creased from late nights and long hours. "Dad," Alejandro said warmly, sitting down across from him, "you look different. How's it going?" Roberto gave him a small smile, setting his coffee cup down. "It's going. I can't say it's easy, but it's better than it was." Alejandro raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Better how?" "I'm here, son," Roberto said, his voice steady, but there was an emotion in his tone that Alejandro wasn't used to hearing. "I'm really here. I'm starting to see that there's still something left to live for. I've been trying to fill a hole I can't fill. The past will always be part of me, but I'm realizing that I can still make room for the present and the future." Alejandro blinked, his emotions catching him off guard. His father, who had always been so reluctant to change, to ask for help, was telling him that he was embracing his new life. There was a quiet pride in Roberto's voice, a sense of acceptance, of peace, that made Alejandro feel a knot in his throat. "You don't know how much that means to me, Dad," Alejandro said softly. "I've been so worried about you, thinking you were, I don't know, stuck." Roberto looked at his son, his eyes softening. "You don't need to worry about me anymore. You've done your part. You've done more than I could have ever asked for. I'm not sure how much I can do for myself, but I'm learning. Slowly, but I'm learning." Alejandro's eyes glistened, and he reached out, placing a hand on his father's arm. "I'm proud of you, Dad. I really am. I think you're finally seeing what I've been trying to tell you all along. There's still a life to be lived, no matter how old we are." Roberto's gaze softened as he looked out the window, taking in the quiet morning. It felt like a small but significant victory, a moment where the world didn't seem so large and overwhelming, a moment when he didn't feel so out of place. "I'm glad you came today," Roberto said, his voice carrying a warmth that surprised even him. "I've been thinking about something. I've been thinking about what I'm going to do next." Alejandro tilted his head, his curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "Well, I've been talking to a few of the other residents here. They've been encouraging me to get more involved in the activities, join in the workshops, do something that challenges me. There's a photography class starting next week. I was thinking about signing up." Alejandro's eyes widened. "Photography, Dad? Really?" Roberto chuckled, his eyes twinkling with a mischievous glint. "You know I used to love taking pictures back in the day. I've forgotten how much I enjoyed it. It's been years since I picked up a camera, but I think it's time to try something new, something that'll make me see the world in a different way." Alejandro couldn't believe his ears. His father, the man who had been so determined to stay locked in the past, was now talking about trying something completely new. It was a shift, a beautiful one. "Dad, I think that's incredible," Alejandro said, his voice thick with emotion. "You know, you don't have to do everything alone. We're all here for you." Roberto smiled, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little bit lighter. "I know. I've been learning that. I think I'm ready to stop carrying all the weight by myself. I've got a lot of life left to live. And if that means learning to take pictures again, or sharing stories with the people here, then so be it." The photography class started the following Monday, and Roberto was one of the first to sign up. He had spent a week refamiliarizing himself with his old camera, a sturdy, slightly worn Canon that had sat in a dusty box in his closet for years. The clicks of the shutter, the simple act of focusing and capturing the world through a lens, was a rediscovery for him. It was like reawakening a dormant part of himself, a part that had always seen beauty in the simplest things: the shape of a leaf, the curve of a child's smile, the play of light on an old building. As the days went by, Roberto felt a growing sense of excitement. He wasn't just living day by day anymore. He was anticipating what each day would bring. He found himself looking for moments to capture, to freeze in time. He would wander the garden at Maplewood House, taking pictures of the flowers after the rain, the elderly residents chatting under the pergola, the birds perched on the fence. He didn't know where these photos would go, or if anyone would ever see them, but he didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt connected to the world around him, not just as a passive observer, but as an active participant. One afternoon, after a particularly successful photography session in the garden, Roberto sat down on a bench, looking at his latest shots. He wasn't sure what he expected. Perhaps an award-winning image, perhaps a moment of revelation. But as he gazed at the images on the camera screen, something else happened. He realized that the true value wasn't in the pictures themselves. It was in the act of seeing the world anew, in the act of engaging with life. His heart swelled with a quiet joy. Maybe, just maybe, he had started to truly live again. The heart of a new beginning. Weeks turned into months, and Roberto Morales found himself in a rhythm he hadn't known for years. He had finally embraced the idea that life didn't end when one reached a certain age. In fact, in many ways, his new life had just begun. Every morning, he would wake up with a sense of purpose, eager to explore new avenues for growth, connection, and self-discovery. Maplewood House, once a place of reluctance, had become a vibrant part of his journey, a place where he could start over, but also a place where the past was gently folded into his present. Roberto had become a regular in the photography class, showing his work during weekly sessions with a group of residents who had also rekindled their creative spirits. The act of framing a moment in time, the soft glow of a sunset, the delicate lines of an old oak tree, had become his meditation, a quiet escape from the noise of the world, yet also a bridge to others. He wasn't alone in his passion. Others, too, had discovered new interests in the late stages of their lives. Some took up painting, others knitting, some even started writing their stories. There was a community now, not defined by age, but by a shared commitment to growth, to embracing the present moment, no matter how many years they had lived. But as time passed, there was one thing Roberto hadn't quite anticipated: his role in the lives of those around him. When he had first moved to Maplewood House, he had been consumed with his own grief, his own fear of becoming a burden. He had doubted whether he would ever find a place in this new world. Yet as he grew more comfortable in his surroundings, something else began to take shape. He found himself listening more closely to others, offering his perspective in ways he hadn't before. His story, the loss of Carmen, the fear of growing old alone, the struggle to find meaning after retirement, resonated with the other residents. He had lived through struggles, yet here he was, still standing, still finding beauty in the small things. It wasn't long before Roberto became something of an informal mentor to many of the other residents. There was Marge, a sprightly woman in her late 80s who had spent most of her life as a nurse. She had always been fiercely independent, but after her husband's passing, she had started to feel a deep sense of isolation. Roberto had invited her to join the photography class one afternoon, suggesting they take a walk around the garden together and capture images of the flowers. "Sometimes the world feels smaller as we age," he had told her. "But there's always something to discover if we open our eyes." Since that day, Marge had been a regular in the class, and her once distant smile had become a fixture in their group. Then there was Frank, a quiet man in his 70s, whose wife had passed several years ago. He'd been reclusive, always sitting alone at the edge of the dining room, never engaging much in conversation. One afternoon, Roberto noticed Frank sitting by himself on the porch, looking out over the landscape. It reminded him of himself not so long ago, lonely, withdrawn, reluctant to connect. So Roberto had walked over and sat beside him. "Beautiful day," Roberto had said, taking a seat next to Frank. Frank nodded without saying much. Roberto knew that sometimes words weren't necessary. They sat there for a while, not talking, just watching the world go by. The soft rustling of leaves in the breeze, the laughter of children playing in the distance, the slow passage of time. After that day, Frank started to come out of his shell. He didn't attend the photography class like Marge, but Roberto often saw him sitting in the garden, staring at the flowers, or sketching in a small notebook he had brought with him. The connection had been small, subtle, but Roberto could see that it had made a difference. He began to understand something deeply important. Even in the later years of life, people craved connection. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments of revelation. Sometimes it was as simple as sharing space with someone, listening without judgment, and giving the gift of presence. One evening, as Roberto sat in the lounge with Marge and Frank, a surprise announcement came over the intercom. It was from Helen, the activities coordinator at Maplewood House. "Good evening, everyone. I'm pleased to announce that we will be hosting a special event next Saturday evening. A night of stories. This will be a chance for all of us to share a personal story, something meaningful or memorable from our lives. It could be a story of love, loss, triumph, or transformation. We invite you to participate, to come and share with the community." As Helen's words echoed through the lounge, Roberto felt a wave of emotion wash over him. The idea of sharing his story, of standing in front of others and revealing the depths of his heart, seemed both exhilarating and terrifying. He hadn't thought of telling his story in such an open way before. He had shared parts of it with close friends, like Marge and Frank, but this felt different, more vulnerable, more public. Yet, deep down, Roberto knew it was exactly what he needed. For the first time in months, the idea of public speaking didn't seem like a daunting task. It felt like an opportunity to finally give voice to the things he had been carrying, not just for himself, but for others. And maybe, just maybe, it would be the final step toward letting go of the weight of the past and embracing the present. The night of the event arrived, and Maplewood House was filled with a sense of anticipation. Residents gathered in the community room, their chairs arranged in a circle. The atmosphere was relaxed, but charged with a kind of quiet energy. Some people had brought photographs, some had written down notes, and others had simply come to listen. Roberto sat at the edge of the circle, his hands resting on his knees. He had decided not to prepare a speech. Instead, he was going to speak from the heart. He didn't need a script. He had lived the story. As the evening began, several residents took turns standing and sharing their stories. There was Rachel, who spoke about her travels across Europe in her youth, and Henry, who shared a funny anecdote about the time he had accidentally proposed to the wrong woman. There was laughter, and there were tears, but each story was a thread in the intricate tapestry of life that everyone in the room had contributed to. Then it was Roberto's turn. He stood slowly, feeling the weight of the room's collective attention. For a moment, he faltered. His palms felt sweaty, his throat tight, but he took a deep breath. "I've lived a long life," Roberto began, his voice steady but soft. "I've known love, I've known loss, and I've known regret. There was a time when I thought my best days were behind me, when I thought I had nothing left to give. I thought that I was just a shadow of who I used to be, too old to start over, too far gone to find joy again." He paused, glancing around the room. The faces looking back at him were kind, understanding. No one was judging him. They were all waiting, eager to hear what he had to say. "But then I realized something," he continued. "It's never too late. The world doesn't stop turning just because we get older. We don't stop growing. It's hard, yes. Sometimes it feels like the hardest thing in the world. But life still has so much to offer, even when you think it doesn't." Roberto smiled, his eyes meeting those of the other residents. "I've learned that we're all here for each other. We don't have to face the hard things alone. And that's something I never understood until I came here. This place, Maplewood House, it's not just a place to live. It's a place to begin again. And that's what I'm doing. I'm beginning again." There was a long pause, and then a soft applause from the group. Roberto could feel the warmth of their appreciation, but more importantly, he felt the warmth of their connection. The evening continued with more stories, but Roberto's words lingered in the air long after he had finished speaking. The night of stories had turned into a celebration of life, a recognition that no matter our age, we all have something worth sharing, something valuable to offer. As Roberto returned to his seat, he realized that he had truly found his place, not just within the walls of Maplewood House, but within himself. He had rediscovered his own strength, his own purpose, and now, more than ever, he understood that the heart of a new beginning was not in starting over, but in embracing all the chapters of life, no matter where they came from, no matter how late they arrived.